Hello friends, welcome back to my video. Before we start, there are 3 random discount codes hidden throughout this video to get you a random roll discount during our April 30th Heat Death sale. I'll talk to you more about that in a bit, but keep your eyes out. Or if you're going to sleep, I guess it doesn't matter. This story is called How I Became a God. It's written by Britton RT on Reddit. You should go check him out. How I became a god. I wasn't smart when I was born. In fact, I was a cripple and a simpleton. I couldn't walk, so I dragged myself around the forest floor, never straying from my mother's presence. I felt at the time she never cared much for my siblings and I, mostly letting us fend for ourselves. But I realize now she kept a careful eye on us. She was cold, distant, and dumb like me, but she knew how to watch for large animals and other potential threats as my brothers, sisters, and I slowly figured out how to feed ourselves. It seems cruel in retrospect, and many of my siblings died young. Life was hard, crawling in the dirt of the forest floor, treating anything remotely edible as a banquet to be cherished. As I slowly grew, she eventually disappeared, leaving me and 2 of my remaining brothers alone at a very young age. They both perished shortly after. But somehow I managed to survive against all odds, crawling in the mud and struggling against my disability, finding food and shelter anywhere I could. I slowly learned how to use my disabilities to my advantage, setting ambushes and traps for small game, but I was still fundamentally an idiot. No matter how clever I thought I was back then, failure was common, and life continued to be difficult. Surviving in the jungle while mentally disabled and handicapped was mostly a factor of sheer luck, though at the time I thought myself to be quite adept. I never stayed in one place for long, and I moved very slowly but carefully. My diet consisted of anything I could find laying around which was edible, mostly small animals I could catch, but I could go hungry for very long periods of time. Eventually, I stumbled on a small stream with an even smaller cave nearby. I made it my home for a while. It wasn't much, but it was hidden well and provided some sense of security. I would drag myself out to the stream and bask in the warm tropical sun at times, take naps under trees, and eat as often as I could manage. Those were my simple pleasures in life back then. Predators were always a threat, and being crippled, running was not an option, so I learned to hide. I learned to read my environment. I learned when to be loud and when to be quiet, and against all odds, I somehow survived. Once again, in retrospect, I mistook luck for cleverness, and that would have been my entire life, up until I starved or finally ran out of luck. But that is where my story really begins, where it should have ended. I was crawling along the forest floor searching for something, anything to eat. It had been many days and I had a furious hunger. All I knew how to do was hobble around, crawling and dragging myself through the jungle, looking for scraps or small animals I could ambush on the ground. I had just pulled myself through a small bush when I saw it. The jaguar was low to the ground, in a pouncing position. On any other day I might have become its meal then and there, but it was focused on something else. I remained absolutely still, barely even breathing, hoping to not draw its attention. It crouched down even further, clearly preparing to strike, its eyes focused like only a hunter's can be. I dared a quick glance at its target, and what I saw was the most unusual bird, giant and dangerous in its own right. Bright and colorful, and nearly the size of the jaguar itself, it was a rainbow of feathers with a crown of plumage on its head. Of course, at the time, I didn't realize how unusual this creature was. All I knew was that this jaguar was going to try and take down the giant avian at any moment, and it did. Try to, at least. The bird took flight the moment the jaguar leapt, and it soared into the canopy, the cat pursuing. I remained still for some time to see if it would return, but eventually eased out into the small clearing. There wasn't much of interest, so I wiggled up the small hill the bird had been resting on, only to find when I reached the top that it was in fact a giant bird's nest, and to my delight, resting inside were 3 very large eggs of unusual color. Of course, I ate them all right then and there, and then dragged myself back to my usual resting spot. Sleeping with a full belly was always its own reward, but that was when things started to change. Over the next few days, I started to notice things I hadn't been aware of before. Small things at first, observations about my surroundings that I hadn't noticed before. The world looked a bit more colorful than it did, shapes a little more defined. I was able to pay attention to more things at once. As days turned to weeks, I started realizing I could make plans that were more sophisticated than just waiting silently for something to run by so I could grab it, or looking for scraps laying around. I started to devise clever traps, using rocks and other features of my environment to help me catch my food, choosing my resting locations in places where bushes and leaves would ensure I could hear predators on the ground. I was still a cripple, but I was growing smarter. I also began to grow bigger, a lot bigger. I had been an underfed runt most of my life, but in the span of several months I'd become a veritable giant, well-nourished now and nearly 6 feet tall, all muscle. I still had to crawl around, but I could do so with a speed and vigor I had never known. I felt optimistic and elated, yet I had no idea what was still to come. As months turned to years, I was able to walk for the first time in my life. Few predators could stand before me now, as I stood nearly 12 feet tall, a titan of the forest, with the strength to match. I strolled carelessly through the trees, eating what I wished, when I wished, where I wished. I built my first house out of stone and fallen trees. I was the king of the jungle. And I climbed my first tree. I will never forget it. Hundreds of feet up in the forest canopy, I finally reached the sunlight atop the tallest tree I could find and looked out upon my domain. Endless green as far as the eye could see in every direction. A playground which had once threatened to consume me, but which was now mine to explore freely. And so I did. I began to travel more. I discovered rivers, waterfalls, groves, huge cave systems, and giant sinkholes and lakes, and so many new types of plants and animals I had never seen. Frogs and birds, cats and spiders, animals which ate plants and plants which ate animals. Over time, I took a special love of watching the tree monkeys, as they were the only other animals which seemed to express an intelligence like my own, which is why when I found a small one which had been injured, I carefully collected it and took it with me. I nursed it back to health, fed it, earned its trust, and it became my little companion. There were no names back then, but none were needed. For the first time in my life, I felt genuine love for this one specific creature, my first friend. I had to take great care, as my growing never seemed to cease. By my memory and estimates, I may have been nearly 30 feet tall by then, and this little monkey was barely a fly by comparison. But the joy he brought me as we traveled together, as he gathered tiny fruits for me, and as he slept peacefully next to me, made me realize how lonely I had been all those decades wandering the forests all by myself, always just watching, but never feeling like more than an observer anymore. When he finally died peacefully of old age, I was of course heartbroken. I knew it was coming. I had seen him slowly weakened and deteriorated. While I seemed to defy the years and continue to grow, time shifted the world around me. Landscapes slowly changed, rivers altered, animals came and went. After he died, I retreated back to a more observational phase of my life again, mostly wandering the forest and indulging in the sights and sounds around me. Gonna take a quick second to plug Heat Death, our merch company. On April 30th, we have our biggest sale ever coming up. Gonna be a ton of old designs, ton of new designs. We do print all of this merch by hand. We pack it all ourselves. You get a little handwritten note. It's a good time. You've heard me talking about it. If you could do me a huge favor and just go to heatdeath.co and sign up for the mailing list, it'd be very appreciated. People on the mailing list get first dibs when the merch drops, and it's just overall a good thing to do to help support. Keep an eye out for those codes, and please go to heatdeath.co. Appreciate you guys. Thanks. I don't know how long I spent like that before they found me. Other monkeys, but these ones were even more like me. They were extremely clever. They made noises at each other in rapid and consistent manners. They used tools like me, maybe even more clever than the ones I devised. And of course, they were terrified of me. I was a giant, towering over them, looming nearly as tall as the trees. I mostly left them alone, but would sometimes go and watch over them. They built strange houses out of sticks and leaves, not too dissimilar to the one I had built out of rocks before I no longer had the need for such a thing. They even appeared to be able to wield fire and lit up the night in the ways I had only seen from the thunder of an angry sky. As time went on, more and more of them would come and visit me, and I slowly gained their trust, even if their caution and fear never fully passed. I learned over time what their noises meant, and after some effort on my part, we were able to communicate quite well. They would often come to me and ask questions about the area, good hunting grounds, water sources, places to make a new village. After all, I had been almost everywhere. One day, some of them started leaving strange carvings in stone around where I slept. I asked one of them about the artifacts, a youngling who had come to ask for my help removing a mighty tree which threatened to fall on his hut. He told me that they were left as offerings so that I might bless them with good fortune. He told me how their lives are hard and short, and then told me that a god such as myself could surely make their lives better. That was the first time I encountered the concept of a god. I had taken a liking to these little ones, so I had already been aiding them with my knowledge whenever they would ask for it. But he was right. I could do more, much more. I remember the look of terror on many of the little people's faces as I towered over their village. Perhaps they were expecting some wrath for a perceived slight. I can't know, but I quickly made it clear I was there to help by removing the offending tree and setting it out of harm's way. Our relationship expanded quickly over the next few years, and they devised great and clever projects which took advantage of my size and relative strength. In those years, we accomplished in days what would have taken them decades on their own, were it even possible at all. We even replaced the village huts with a more durable collective structure, stone stacked so tall that they dwarfed the trees around them. The giant pile of boulders was carefully stacked to create living space to spare, a crude pyramid of sorts, I would later come to realize. Things went well for a while, and I took a very active role in the lives of my new friends. It reminded me of my old monkey friend from so long ago, except this time there were many, and I could speak to them and share my thoughts and feelings. It was an exhilarating time for me, and we accomplished much. We dug trenches to allow water to reach areas where they could cultivate crops. We studied the stars together and speculated on the mysteries of the forest and the world. I watched friends be born, age, die, only for new friends to appear. After many, many years, though, the number of friends grew and grew and grew. Eventually, there were so many they began to fight each other over what seemed to be the infinite bounty of the forest. Their noises changed, and I could no longer understand all of them anymore, only the ones I remained near. They began to ask me for help or blessings hunting other people, fighting other villages. I always refused. The tipping point came when the village I attended attempted to sacrifice a young girl in my name in order to gain my support in an upcoming raid. I had tried to tolerate them and understand them, but their pettiness had boiled over, and I was exacerbated. There were too many people, too many villages, too many conflicts, too much sadness. It felt like I was crawling through the mud again, a dumb cripple, unsure what to do or where to go, and with little means to accomplish anything. I realized the moment they placed that little girl on the altar that I had forgotten what it meant to be helpless, so I accepted their sacrifice. I took the girl, and I left that village and never returned. I went as far as I could away from that place, and I did my best to take care of that little girl. She was small and frightened at first, but grew to trust me over time. We traveled south until we reached a great cliff with a waterfall, far away from the little people. I built her a little house of stones at the top of the cliff right next to the waterfall, with a spectacular view of the forest below. I didn't even think to ask her name until she took the initiative to tell me, much later. Names have no meaning in the forest, but I discovered it was Sakniente, an old and beautiful name I will never forget. We were together for a long time. She grew up, and once again more little people discovered us. Once again they would come and ask for advice at first, and once again the requests would grow to be increasingly more and more demanding. Untrusting of the little people now, I would often withdraw or refuse to speak to them. Often I could not even understand their noises anymore, but Sakniente would take over and represent me in my stead when the weight of it all became too much. She even put feathers on her head, like me, in order to gain some trust and status from the visitors, so they would eventually come to understand that I trusted her. After a time, it almost became expected that she was the one you would speak to when you came to me, which I was fine with. She never once misrepresented me. We were both children of a similar fortune, abandoned by fate, but then entrusted with something special we could use to help others, and I knew she could be trustworthy. I slowly came to understand that she was good at what she did. I watched her mend divides, forge alliances, and eventually even end a war. I was a simple person of the forest, but she was a politician, and she knew how to use my name and power to change the little people, to make them better. I loved her, more than I even loved that little monkey. She was kind, gentle, but intelligent and uncompromising. She taught me things I'd never heard of, things she'd learned from our visitors. We had no needs, so knowledge was paid for with knowledge. Forms of what I would later find were arithmetic, astronomy, philosophy, and more slowly arrived bit by bit. It gave me a new window into the world around me, one I had never given its due consideration, despite being more ancient than many of the trees. It always amazed me that these little people were so creative and intelligent, and it was her. She was the one who in the end inspired me to put my faith in them again. I started to take a more active role once more, but being mostly stuck in one place, I studied and philosophized and tried to make myself useful to the little people in the ways I could. I slurped up knowledge, and I offered it back to any who asked. I was too big to move so freely around the woods now without laying waste to it, but the little people seemed more than happy to come to me. Sakniente even gave me a name, and while the little people had called me many things before, this was the first one I truly took to heart, and in those years, my heart grew nearly as fast as I did. When she died, I was once again heartbroken. It was a tragic accident, nearly 140 feet now. I was so massive it was hard to even move through the woods anymore without trampling everything in my path. I tended to just remain in the same spot near the top of the waterfall as a result, and spent most of my time asleep or staring out over the vast and beautiful jungle, framed by the mountains hundreds of miles behind it. I don't know why she had come so close to me while I was sleeping that night, or what cruelty of fate caused me to roll over, but when I woke up, I found I had accidentally crushed her to death. I could barely even recognize her. I had seen the little people cry before, but that was the first time I myself had ever truly wept. I hadn't even realized I was capable of it. I retreated deeper into the forest after that, avoiding everything. Everyone was so small, and I was so dangerously large. I just wanted to go hide in a cave somewhere and never come out. But even finding such a large cavern now would seem nearly impossible, as was so often the case in my life. I do not know how much time passed, probably ages, but eventually the little people found me again, as they always did. But this time, it was different. They remembered my name. They brought me food and gifts. They once again asked for my knowledge and my help to save and improve their lives. I enjoyed their company despite my distrust, apathy, and depression. Eventually, though, they asked me to come with them to their town, and after much deliberation, I finally agreed. What I found when I arrived there was a landscape drastically transformed, the massive destruction of a forest replaced by farmland, and a great city made of stacked stone, much like the one I had made so long ago, but much more refined and massive, and the number of little people was uncountable. The forest devastation was so great that I could not even see the trees on the other side of the city. I just stood there, towering over everything, and felt horror ripple through me from my head to my toes. It felt as though this was somehow all my fault. I should have known this would happen. I should never have helped the little people, for they were so smart that the forest itself had become their prey. Or maybe I should have helped them more, taught them to be better stewards of the forest, not destroyers of it. I immediately left without a word back back the way I came. They followed me yelling and crying my name for some while before eventually giving up and returning to their desolation of a home. And that's it for part 1. I hope you liked it. This story is really cool. There is a part 2, so let me know down in the comments if you would like to hear it, and just let me know. April 30th, HEATDEATH.co. Y'all know the drill. I won't bug you. Thank you so much for your support. I hope you have a great night. Sleep tight. Subscribe or don't. Thanks.